welcome panelists and audience on behalf of the Galien Foundation and the Global Virus Network and the Jerusalem Ethics Forum. I'm Kenneth Moch, a serial biotech entrepreneur and currently a senior advisor to the chairman at the Center for Global Health Innovation and the Global Health Crisis Coordination Center. I also spent many years on the board of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, where one of my key areas of interest was the development of new medicines for highly prevalent chronic diseases. I am truly delighted to serve as the moderator for today's webinar, which has been co-organized by the Galien Foundation and the Global Virus Network on the occasion of the annual Jerusalem Ethics Forum. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that the Galien Foundation has hosted to explore the intersection of ethics and global health in support of the Foundation's mission to catalyze innovation to improve the human condition. Galien is also hosting webinars focused on digital health, disease-specific issues, and Africa's growing role in medical innovation. And we are all pleased to be part of this very noble effort. I've had the honor over the past year of hosting two prior webinars for the Galien Foundation. One at last year's Jerusalem Ethics Forum, where the topic was the social, legal, and ethical challenges across access to COVID-19 vaccines, and the other in March of this year, for which the topic was ethics and economics, COVID-19 at the crossroads of global health. These two webinars, and many others, of course, focused on a pandemic that has necessarily diverted attention and diverted much needed resources from other disease areas. And while this global emergency is far from over, as we approach the new year, it is not too early to start discussing and memorializing the learning experiences from the pandemic, and not too early to begin thinking about how these learning experiences can be applied to the treatment of many other diseases that continue to exact tremendous economic and human tolls on billions of people across the globe, particularly those in marginalized communities in the developing world. So, that is the focus of today's discussion, to explore how insights from the COVID-19 pandemic can be applied to developing medicines and building infrastructure for highly prevalent, neglected diseases. What is being done to address these diseases and their burdens? What is being done to develop new tools and innovative approaches? And from an overarching perspective, how can we apply the lessons and innovations from the COVID-19 response to better address these ongoing health challenges and to improve health equity for the rest of the world? Today's webinar will feature insights and perspectives from a truly stellar group of experts whose extraordinary backgrounds cross academia, industry, government, and non-governmental organizations. They know each other well, as I learned in the prep session, and so we should look forward to a truly interactive and informative dialogue. Unfortunately, just to start, Mwele Malasela, the director of the Department of Control of Neglected Tropical Diseases from the World Health Organization, is unable to join us today, and we will miss her in this dialogue. The detailed bios for the three panelists are on the Galien Foundation website, but let's get started by asking each panelist to introduce her or himself so that the webinar audience has a sense of their truly unique backgrounds. And let's do so alphabetically, first with Julie Gerberding, MD, PhD, the Chief Patient Officer and Executive Vice President, Population Health and Sustainability for Merck Co. Julie?
Good morning, and thank you so much for including me in the panel. I am the Chief Patient Officer at Merck, and so the broad issues that we're talking today are, of course, germane to me personally, but more broadly thinking, all of us in the health sector have a stake in making sure that we do harvest the lessons learned from this COVID pandemic and apply them to do a better job with many of the other diseases and conditions that afflict people, and particularly account for the incredible health inequities that have been so important in understanding the spread of this particular virus. I also am part of the Bio Executive Committee that you mentioned earlier, and this has been an amazing time to participate as the biopharmaceutical industry around the world has come up with some 830 products that were in various stages of clinical development by the end of last year, really demonstrating how important science is in all of this. And yet, with all of our fantastic science, we still struggle to get our innovations into the arms or the mouths of the people who can really benefit from them. So I look forward to this conversation in that spirit. Thank you.
Yeah, Julie, could you just quickly go back a little further in your career? Because I think that perspective as it comes up today will help as well.
Oh, sure. How far back would you like me to go? I think I can start with why I'm an infectious disease doctor, and that takes me all the way back to San Francisco General and UCSF at the very beginning of the AIDS pandemic. And so my life is kind of bookended by two really, really different but equally important global infectious disease challenges. And in between those two bookends, I served as the CDC director in the United States from 2002 to 2009. So I had the benefit of being involved in the early phases of the terrorism attacks, as well as SARS in 2003, and a number of other infectious disease challenges. And I might add, I had the pleasure of working with Rajeev in several of those earlier chapters in my life. So it's really fun to come back and participate in this conversation with my good friend and colleague.
And that's a good setup for Rajeev Venkayya, MD, the president of the Global Vaccine Business Unit at Takeda Pharmaceutical Company.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. It's great to be a part of this panel and great to see Julie and Scott here. I'm currently overseeing the vaccine business unit at Takeda, where we have a number of programs that are very relevant to today's discussion. We're actually developing a dengue vaccine candidate. Dengue is a tough challenge, but we began filing for licensure around the world on the basis of phase 3 data, and we hope to launch that vaccine soon. We're also developing a Zika vaccine, and we are working with partners on COVID. Prior to joining Takeda, I've worked at the Gates Foundation and at the White House on global health and biodefense and pandemic issues, and I'm trained as a pulmonary and critical care physician, and had the pleasure of working alongside Julie at San Francisco General Hospital at UCSF, the first of a few times we've had a chance to work together.
Great, and thank you. And finally, Scott Weaver, MS, PhD of the University of Texas Medical Branch, where he is the John Seeley Distinguished University Chair in Human Infections and Immunity, Chair of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology, Director of the Institute for Human Infections and Immunity, Scientific Director of the Galveston National Laboratory, and the Global Virus Network Center Director. So Scott.
Thank you very much, Ken, and it's a great privilege and honor to participate in this discussion today. I've been working for about 40 years in my career, mostly on mosquito-borne viral diseases. Like Rajeev just mentioned, Zika and chikungunya are two of those. And I had the opportunity for several years to work with Rajeev and others on vaccines for arboviral diseases. But my main interest for those 40 years has been in the epidemiology and the ecology of these kind of vector-borne diseases and the mechanisms that allow them to emerge to start these huge outbreaks like we've seen for many decades with dengue and most recently with chikungunya and Zika arriving here in the Americas. And like many virologists, I pivoted the last 2 years to working on SARS coronavirus 2 to some of the same kind of topics, understanding how the variants of this virus have emerged and how they're transmitted more efficiently, and testing new vaccines and other countermeasures to protect against COVID-19. So, but the perspective I hope to share today is a person who's done a lot of field work in the tropics, studying neglected diseases and what some of the challenges are to just the fundamentals of identifying where medicines or vaccines are needed and how to identify the right populations of people where efficacy trials can be conducted to get testing and licensure of new products accomplished.
Thanks, Scott. And that's a perfect lead into our overarching questions for today, which from the perspective of learning experiences, which are these. What are the challenges that you and your colleagues have found most daunting or problematic? And what are the trends or specific developments in your focus area that you're most excited about? So Scott, let's start with you, building on what you just said in your introduction.
Sure. So when I got involved in vaccine development, I was mostly studying viruses that had recently emerged to cause major epidemics, not quite on the scale of COVID-19, but viruses that had spread around the world for the first time, at least in a century, to the Americas, like Zika and chikungunya. And but I'd been studying these kind of viruses my whole career, even before they caused these major epidemics. And through getting involved in vaccine development, I learned a lot about the importance of having good surveillance to identify where these kind of agents have a risk of emerging and causing human infection, which of course is really important because developing any product, you've got to know how many people are exposed and at risk, where they're located, what the timing of risk is. And this is all important for many reasons, of course, for determining whether there's a need for a product to begin with or whether there's a market, if it's a commercial developer considering investing hundreds of millions of dollars in a new vaccine, as is typical. What I've learned is that in most parts of the tropics, for most neglected tropical diseases, they have very similar clinical presentations. If you're studying people in Latin America or Southeast Asia or even Africa who develop kind of a non-specific flu-like illness, they could have one of many dozens of different kinds of infections. And in the absence of good laboratory diagnostics, which is typical in all of these regions, clinicians have to make an educated guess about what people are actually infected with. And they often select the most common, at least known to be common diseases like malaria and dengue when they make those clinical diagnoses. But it turns out in many studies that we and others have done that about 2/3 of the time when you make those diagnoses just based on the clinical presentation of a patient, you get it wrong. And you miss things like chikungunya and Zika, which were missed for decades during the past few decades before they were recognized only after causing major epidemics. And you underappreciate the importance of many of these things, and you don't provide the information needed for companies to assess whether a product is needed and whether, just as importantly, whether there's an opportunity to do efficacy testing once you have a product that's gone the whole way through to phase 3 clinical trials. And unfortunately, the foundation of this problem is the lack of diagnostics. And if you live in most parts of the world, in the tropics, and you have a non-specific febrile illness, you have body aches and a headache and fever and maybe joint pains, and you go for clinical care, there's simply no diagnostics available. The healthcare provider seeing you makes their best guess based on your signs and symptoms. There's often no treatment available anyway if it's a viral disease. They may be able to test you for malaria and give you a malaria treatment, but often malaria infections are chronic in adults and they're not actually the cause of the illness. So the lack of diagnostics is really the foundation for a lot of the major challenges we face with developing new vaccines and medicines for neglected tropical diseases. And I think one thing that the COVID outbreak has taught us is that number one, we have to have a very deep bench in our scientific team for developing diagnostics. We can't rely on one entity in each country or a few entities worldwide. We can't rely on companies in Europe or the United States to provide diagnostics for the world, especially for resource-limited settings in the tropics. And we have to help countries in those parts of the world to develop their own capacity for doing diagnostics and also for developing some of the products and manufacturing them. And as we've learned all too well in COVID, diagnostics has been very lacking, especially in Africa. Vaccines have not been distributed uniformly throughout the world. Very small numbers of people have been vaccinated, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think these are the same challenges we're going to continue to face with all kinds of neglected tropical diseases. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great. And we'll come back to that because I'd like to ask it as we go through this and ask the other panelists to comment on these questions. You know, what's going to remain after the central emergency, if you will, declines, at least in the Western world, and that question of surveillance and looking at epidemiology, I think is a crucial one that we should focus on. But let's go through first, having people talk about their key issues. And Julie Gerberding, you're next up.
Well, thank you. And Scott, you kind of set the stage for, I think, a deeper dive into some of these critical capabilities. But we have long understood the concept of emergence, that infectious disease challenges will appear either from spillover from animals or by intent or by accident, hopefully less of the latter. And the former is an area that is becoming obvious in the context of this pandemic. But I think for those of us who've been working in this field, it's been obvious to us for some time. And it's been a little bit frustrating to see the cycle of complacency and then crisis that we go through over and over again as a new infectious disease problem emerges. And in fact, I co-chair the CSIS Commission on Improving America's Health Protection. And this was the title of our report that came out last November, just before November of 2019, just before the pandemic began. So we go through this cycle of responding to these infectious disease threats, but not really adequately preparing for them. So I think one of the large frames in industry, we have to struggle with this, but it's actually a societal and really a global opportunity here to change our paradigm. We need to really be thinking not just about how do we improve surveillance, detection, containment, and response, but how can we move upstream and really begin to think about predicting where these infections are most likely to emerge, being able to preempt them by having better countermeasures already in the early stages of development, or platforms of countermeasures that can be quickly adapted to be more available more quickly in the context of an emergence, so that we don't end up with a pandemic before we actually have tools to combat it. And I think there's some hope in the context of the pandemic. I've already mentioned the number of innovative countermeasures and diagnostics that have been in clinical development so quickly, unprecedented. Certainly didn't expect to have a vaccine for SARS in 2003 in any time relevant to the management of that particular outbreak. But we did learn in this context that having prior work, Scott mentioned some of his work, Rajeev has been working on viral emergent viruses, but because we had SARS in 2003 and then we experienced MERS on an ongoing basis spilling over in the Middle East, there had been a great deal of work on coronaviruses in the background. And so it really wasn't a leap of faith to think, well, if we have a spike protein vaccine that looks like it could be promising for, say, MERS, how hard is it to change out the spike protein and create a virus that's more specific for the coronavirus that we're experiencing right now? So that platform concept is one that I think is the real opportunity for those of us who are interested in countermeasure development. And I think we could begin to think of the same thing in antivirals. We know the families of viral proteins. We have an assumption that it's unlikely we're going to see a completely unprecedented pathogen. Generally, they're within families of familiar classes or genera of viruses, so that we could have the ability to have countermeasures in various stages of preparation and stockpiling that would be much more available. The problem with all of that is it's really risky for any given entity to take that on. So CEPI, the entity that was created really following the Western Africa Ebola outbreak, really set the stage for preemptive countermeasure development. And I think that has proven to be an extremely important demonstration of what we need to do better going forward. We have to, first of all, apply our science to this particular problem set much more broadly, not reacting to an emergence, but proactively leaning into the likely pathogens of interest. And second, we need to de-risk the engagement of our academic community, our biotechnology community, our large pharmaceutical community, and we need to then plan and prepare for the prospects of broad scale manufacturing, which is right now something that has been a bottleneck in the context of the current pandemic, but is a problem that's really an engineering problem, and that can be solved. It just takes investment, planning, commitment, and probably most of all, sustained engagement. Our overall response for the experience in my lifetime has been one that is relatively irregular, feast or famine, you might say. And so we have to really get our heads around the fact that these emerging infectious disease problems are with us. They come on top of the neglected problems that we've known about for a long time. And all of them have in common the requirement that we think globally and remember that we are only as strong as our weakest link. Just this morning, I picked up news from the Infectious Disease Society of America, the IDSA regular newsletter, and was greeted with the perspective that 22 million children missed their measles vaccination last year. That's astonishing. And it just really tells us that we have a long way to go to really assure the kind of infectious disease health security that we're going to need going forward in this world.
All right, we'll come back to these and also come back, I think, Julie, to the One Health issue that you had mentioned in our prior discussion, unless you want to elaborate on that now.
I think I would love to hear from Rajeev, but we can come back to that because it kind of ties us all together.
All right, well, let's use that as the tie then after Rajiv's comments. You're on.
Well, thank you, Ken. Thanks, Julie. I mean, Scott and Julie really did cover and nicely set the stage for the discussion of countermeasures. Julie touched on the start and stop nature of the R&D that happened on SARS-CoV-1 and then MERS, which to put that into context, if we look at the mid 2000s when H5N1 emerged in Asia, and there's a lot of concern and focus on influenza pandemic planning. We had in the background, SARS had emerged a couple of years earlier, MERS then followed. We had these coronaviruses that were cropping up, and we didn't appreciate, of course we do now, that coronaviruses are probably on par with flu viruses as being the most likely contender to cause the next significant pandemic. We didn't carry through on SARS vaccine programs or MERS vaccine programs fully, although CEPI has been working on MERS. But fortunately, the R&D that was done on the spike protein and specifically the strategy to stabilize the spike protein proved to be invaluable in vaccine development very quickly after the identification of SARS-CoV-2. So we didn't start from nothing, and I think that is a positive, but it highlights the importance of carrying through. I mentioned Zika. Zika came and went as epidemic diseases will do. Chikungunya that Scott mentioned is another good example. When an emergency like that arises, there's a lot of attention and a lot of R&D gets started, but oftentimes that R&D doesn't get sustained or isn't sustained because the threat goes away. And we've seen that happen with those other diseases that I've mentioned. Fortunately, in Zika, there is still sustained R&D investment that is happening, at least from the U.S. government and some other at some companies outside of the U.S. So hopefully we'll be in a better position to deal with Zika when it comes back. Now, I think that the COVID experience has taught us a number of other things and created new opportunities for us to change the investment thesis around emerging infectious diseases. We often focus on, as rightly so, the benefits that we've seen with the mRNA platform, which largely gets away from the biology of making vaccines, which often involves growing up viruses in cells and developing assays to characterize the product throughout. All of that is very, very complicated and risky. Shifting from that biology to chemistry associated with mRNA vaccine development, manufacturing, and scale up, much less risky, much more reproducible at high quality. But what's interesting is that we also saw significant acceleration of the traditional platforms as well. We saw vectored vaccines come to the market soon after the mRNAs, and similarly with the recombinant particle vaccine that we've seen with from Novavax. So it is possible to substantially accelerate development of vaccines across many platforms, and that's really good news, because from an industry standpoint, if you can shorten the shorten the timeline, reduce the technical risk, and reduce the capital required to advance a vaccine program through development, you substantially improve the investment thesis and make it more competitive relative to other ways a company can deploy capital. So those advances in technology and learnings about how to accelerate development and de-risk are, I think, going to be really important for us as we think about planning for the next pandemic threat, but also in developing "quote unquote" peacetime vaccines. Julie mentioned the CEPI strategy. I'm fortunate to sit on the board of CEPI right now. Julie has been on the board in the past. CEPI has laid out a very ambitious strategy that has also been taken up by the U.S. government, building upon a thesis of Barney Graham's, that you can go from developing broadly neutralizing antibodies to pathogens, to target epitopes that are conserved across pathogens within a family, and then per CEPI and the US government, develop prototype vaccines that are broadly protective against multiple viruses in a family. And if you take that same approach across the 25 or 26 families of viruses that from which the next pandemic threat could emerge, you can envision a world in which, with focused investment, as Julie has suggested, that we can actually get a stable of vaccines that helps us to take the next pandemic threat, maybe not completely off the table, but significantly reduce the time it takes to have vaccines in large-scale clinical trials, and then scaled up to be manufactured for large populations. So this is the vision. For the first time in history, we have the opportunity to consider taking the pandemic threat off the table in part, and that's just an incredible place to be as a society. Now it's on us to deploy the science with the appropriate financial resources to make that vision a reality.
That's great. So this is the point where I'd like to ask the three of you to have an interactive dialogue on what you just said, because we've talked about identification, we've talked about infrastructure, and we've talked about speed. And I'm sure there are other keywords I could use right now, but they become the learning experiences. So either one of you want to take the first step in commenting on your fellow panelists' comments?
Yeah, I just want to jump in because, and I heard Rajeev just say that for the first time we have a potential to be able to take pandemic threats off the table. That's something that we really need to say over and over again, because I'm not sure people are quite grasping the absolute phenomenon that really is. And I always say science is on our side, but obviously it takes more than science. It does take that level of commitment and investment, but it also takes some software, including an amazing amount of collaboration, which is hard and not necessarily easy on a global basis, given all of the conflicts and agendas in the world today. But it also takes trust. And I think we have to remember that when we talk about countermeasures and platforms and the possibilities that science can create for us right now, that we have to bring society along with us in that conversation. Because as we're seeing today, it isn't just a matter of how many doses of vaccine or even how those doses are allocated, if at the end of the day there isn't enough trust and confidence in what we're doing to make it valuable to individual people. That's kind of the tragedy that compounds the tragedy of the inequities that we're experiencing in the world. So it's a daunting challenge to think, how do we really fulfill Rajeev's vision here? But I really, if there's one thing I hope people remember from this conversation, is that it is possible to do this. This is not a fantasy or a wishful thinking. We have the capacity to be able to do this if we have the will and the commitment.
And maybe if I could just punctuate that, Julie, when I think about the pandemic threats, I put it in the category, as many do, of things like climate change, plastic pollution, asteroid hitting the Earth. I mean, these are existential threats that we have very little hope of tackling in the near term. These are massive undertakings. I view the technology and the knowledge we now have to tackle pandemics as akin to a tool to control the Earth's warming by 1.5 degrees. How incredible would that be if we had a technology that could limit the Earth's warming? And we'd be celebrating that, we'd be investing in it, because we'd be able to take a critical, generational, multi-generational threat off the table. Pandemics are a multi-generational threat, and we're the first generation that has a chance to do something about it. So I think that this is something that political leaders, those deciding how to invest and focus research dollars, need to understand.
I'd like to comment on some very positive developments the past couple of years in this idea that we can take pandemic threats off the table. The first is earlier this week, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease of the NIH held a conference on pandemic preparedness. They had a very nice strategy where they selected 7 families of viruses that are considered the highest risk for emergence and pandemic spread. They convened a group of somewhere between 10 and 20 experts on each of these virus families to discuss what are the gaps in knowledge that we need to overcome to allow us to be in a position where we can, within 3 months, have a vaccine in clinical trials for any member of that family. And how can we take one prototype member of that family and do proof of principle studies to understand the basic science? What are the structures of the proteins that are targeted by neutralizing antibodies? What do we need to understand about the immune response and what's protection? And so hopefully they're going to have the funding to follow this through for each of these 7 families and focus on the basic science needed to prepare us for this kind of rapid response to any agent in that family based on a prototype that's been studied very thoroughly, to having products turned around very quickly and being able to more or less intercept the pandemic before it becomes worldwide, to ideally to intercept it locally where it begins. And the other program that the NIH actually developed a couple of years ago before the COVID-19 outbreak even began, I think was also very proactive, and that was to develop 10 new centers of research for emerging infectious diseases, which are located around the world, many of them in the tropics where we know the highest risk of these agents emerging is. Diverse programs on different kinds of viral infections, such as coronaviruses, influenza, the mosquito-borne viruses that we work on. And they really sought groups that could take the One Health approach to understanding the risk of emergence by studying the wildlife populations where these viruses normally circulate, where and when is the contact between those wildlife populations and humans, what's the risk of a virus jumping from the wildlife host into humans, where and when might that happen, and then how could we detect that very quickly so that we can shut down the outbreak locally rather than waiting until it spreads to another continent or worldwide. And then we're facing a COVID type situation where we have a pandemic and it costs us trillions of dollars to intervene. So I think there are positive developments, and hopefully these programs will be sustained even if COVID is overcome in the next year or two and we don't see any other major viral emergences. As Julie said, we have to be working on these problems constantly in between outbreaks get out of this boom and bust funding cycles that we've seen for the past couple decades. And then I think we do have a realistic chance of getting out ahead of these pandemic agents, as Rajeev explained.
Let's just spend a few more minutes on this, and maybe the question's framed like this: where do these learning experiences and capabilities reside after the pandemic? What's the repository for this, kind of like Foundation for those of you who've read the trilogy? And is it just boom or bust, complacency and crisis? That's a way of really asking that question. How are they being funded after the pandemic? Do you see any evidence yet of a continuum of funding and a continuum of sharing? What is that telling you now from your various perches?
Yeah, I think we have choices to make, Ken. I like to use the lesson I learned from reading an interview that an author, Arundhati Roy, stated in a Financial Times interview at the beginning of the pandemic. And she said, the pandemic is a portal, and how we walk through it really is a choice we have to make. Do we walk through and resume the old normal and do things the old way, or do we walk through lightened and refreshed with a different kind of commitment to how we manage these things in the future? And I found that concept so profound. It's really motivated a lot of the energy that I've tried to put into emphasizing the importance of recognizing that these emerging infectious disease threats are existential. It isn't just a health issue, it's a national security issue, it's a humanitarian issue, and we have to adjust the order of magnitude that we use to address it. I do think we have some reason for hope. As Scott has just mentioned, there was work going on coronaviruses before the pandemic evolved, and now the scientific infrastructure of our world has recognized the importance of thinking more broadly, even in the context of this pandemic. So our scientists hopefully will be incentivized in the resources to continue to support that through government funding mechanisms, or civil society mechanisms will continue. CEPI was funded before the pandemic. Granted, it came after the West African outbreak, but so there was a spotlight on emergence and the incredible impact and threat that they can create for the world. But nevertheless, CEPI got started, launched, and had a significant amount of resource to get started before this pandemic. And certainly we can advocate to manage to grow that and continue it going forward. So I think some of the mechanisms, COVAX is another example, active at the NIH. We have created some novel, in a sense, innovative mechanisms for sustaining the research going forward. But we also have to really, really make the strong case that the scale of investment has to be commensurate with the degree of threat that we are experiencing. And that's where our scientific voices have to be speaking to various stakeholders. Certainly governments loom large on that list, as well as the alliances across governments, getting the G7 or the G20 or the UN, getting the broader commitment over the long run, really the only way to truly address these existential threats. But in addition to that, I think we have different kinds of stakeholders speaking on behalf of large and small biopharmaceutical entities. We have to think differently about how we engage. No company can afford to have idle capacity of manufacturing standing by in case they're needed to manufacture a vaccine. But collectively, we do have enormous capacity and capability, sort of intellectual property and know-how that is all too rare in the world. But when it's pooled together and applied to unity of purpose, we can, and I think just have demonstrated how far and how fast we can go in a more collaborative model. So how do we commit to that kind of ongoing collaboration, and what is necessary to help provide the wiring to make that last? And that involves investments by governments or other entities to assure that we can afford the risk and the capital investment necessary to create and sustain those capacities, and to constantly evolve them as new knowledge and new opportunities for countermeasure development come into play. So there, I could go on with other stakeholder groups that have a role to play in all of this, but I think the point is what we've been lacking on a global basis for forever, I would say, is really an effective global mechanism to really provide this leadership. And even in the US, every time we have a new outbreak, we invent a new government construct to handle it, rather than kind of agreeing that, guess what, these things will continue to happen and we need to have structural change as well as budgetary change that really helps us sustain the effort on an ongoing progressive basis, and not the boomer bust that we've been talking about.
Just to build on the great point that Julie made, at a more local level, as one example, after the West African Ebola outbreak ended about 5 years ago, unfortunately, the capacity, the infrastructure, and even the expertise for doing diagnostics, maybe to some extent even for treating patients, has gradually waned in West Africa. And just earlier this year, we had the first case of Ebola since that outbreak ended in Guinea. And we also had the first detection ever of Marburg virus, a relative of Ebola, in Guinea. And there were no diagnostics available in the surrounding countries or in Guinea to quickly gear up to see whether these infections were spreading in the human population. Those capabilities, expertise, and even the infrastructure had gradually disappeared since the Ebola outbreak. So we really have to find ways to sustain these capabilities in the locations where these viruses tend to emerge first, and be prepared to diagnose them quickly and to intervene very quickly to stop the outbreaks. And we can't just wait for the next outbreak to come along and try to recreate those resources. It's much easier and much more feasible and more economical to try to maintain those capabilities in the regions between outbreaks.
Let's build on that for a second. Unfortunately, Moelle wasn't able to join us, but let's look a little more deeply at what is going on in Africa, the African Medicines Agency or other entities that are trying to advance the state of response and capabilities of response. And I think the three of you obviously have very good perspectives, again, from your various endeavors. And can we elaborate on that some more?
Well, I think the question of equity in this pandemic has now been linked to the issue of self-determination and control of one's own destiny. Because what we've seen is that there has been a very significant disproportionate allocation of all of the countermeasures to wealthy countries, despite the existence of COVAX, despite a number of individuals and organizations trying to prevent this from happening. It happened anyway. And so one conclusion that many have appropriately reached, I believe, is that we need to build capacity to develop and make countermeasures, vaccines, therapeutics in all regions. And the focus right now is on sub-Saharan Africa, or the African region. And the reality is that it can happen, and it will happen with focus and sustained investment. But it's not a simple matter of building a factory, even if it's one that has a tech transfer associated with it. It takes an ecosystem that at the center includes human capital, and building a pool of talent that ideally on an R&D base that can support not only the manufacturing, but also the quality systems, further R&D, and all of the corollary activities necessary to support product development, like regulatory competence. So there needs to be a commitment to develop this ecosystem over time, and it absolutely can and will happen. I think the commitment now to an African Medicines Agency is a wonderful step in the right direction. Regulatory harmonization work in the African region has been underway for a very long time, and it's coming to fruition now. I think embodied in the future agency. And if you could have a centralized process in the region similar to what exists in Europe, that could be a tremendous enabler for the entire region for product development and rapid access to medicines as they become available. And it also would reduce the current requirement on every country to have substantial investment to build their own regulatory capacity. It doesn't take away the need for sovereignty and some regulatory capacity, but it does a lot to streamline the process and also centralize some capacity so that it doesn't have to be duplicated at country level. So I think that this is a very important step in the right direction. We do need industry companies to step up to offer to support with technology transfer and helping to build that ecosystem that I developed. But I'm confident that that can and will happen.
Scott and Julie, want to comment or?
I certainly agree with Rajeev. I do also think that there is we can't underestimate the challenge. I guess that would be the best way of putting it, that there is not a surplus of know-how in the space of vaccine invention and manufacturing. And so we have to really be prepared again to invest over a long arc of time to really build out that capability. I had a chance to hear from Peter Sandwood from the Global Fund, and I really should have known this or intuited it, but I hadn't thought about it, that the investments that the Global Fund has made in TB, malaria, and HIV diagnostics has at the local level been so important to help promote the diagnostic capability in the context of this pandemic. And so, we have made many important vertical investments in various kinds of programs and various kinds of capacities, but we have to think about now as a more horizontal integration of what we are doing so that we can more readily repurpose or take advantage of what really is a bottleneck in our overall global security agenda. We should also mention the importance of the global health security agenda that the United States government and others have invested in. It's a painstakingly slow process to understand at a country level what is the current state of biopreparedness and biosecurity response capacity, but then to systematically help identify where investments are leveraged, where the resources for those investments can be derived, and how we can monitor and measure progressive improvement in our country by country global health security. I think we got a good start of that several years ago when those investments were first made, again, kind of in the wake of the Ebola outbreak and Zika outbreak that followed. But nevertheless, if we haven't learned our lesson now about the importance of improving this country by country, particularly in the least resource countries, then we really are in trouble, because I can't imagine a harsher lesson than the one, I can't imagine it, but I hope we never see a harsher lesson than the one we're experiencing right now. So at some point we have to kind of step back and look at our overall global investment in infectious disease and really make sure that we take advantage of the dots that can be connected and fill in the gaps of the places where we're still lacking, because the actual shortage of capacity, human capital is a major component of that, but of course financial resources as well. And coming out of this pandemic, it's going to be tough to get countries to want to do more on behalf of others when each country is going to be figuring out how to pay its own bills in the wake of this pandemic. So we really have to make sure that we think in a comprehensive way about what to do to address the global need going forward.
I'd like to just circle back for a moment again to diagnostics, which I think is the foundation for a lot of the improvements we need. No matter how many research groups we fund around the world studying potential emergent sites of these kind of diseases. No matter how many good laboratories we equip in countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world to do state-of-the-art diagnostics, if we don't have point-of-care tests, inexpensive, easy to implement, easy to interpret, like we've seen developed on a very large scale for COVID-19 very successfully, we're still not going to have a good set of eyes on what's out there with being the next risk for emergence. So I think rapid point of care, inexpensive diagnostics that can be implemented at the clinics and the small villages or towns throughout the tropics is really the key to making the next real major improvement in having good surveillance for the next thing to come along and making sure that we don't miss the early stages of some kind of emerging viral disease.
And could I just add to that, Scott, because I think we're really focusing on human health right now, but it is a One Health challenge that we need the same kinds of capacities in the animal health world and perhaps even in the plant health world. But when we really are thinking about emergence and spillover, we have so much to learn about animal infectious diseases. And we could just use bats as an example, but any of the mammalian species that are the most common, bats and rats, come to my mind. But there are so many mammals that harbor viruses of relevance to human health, and yet we have barely scratched the surface in understanding where are they, how are they transmitted, what is their ecosystem, and how all of this is influenced by weather patterns and or more global climate change issues. So it is a One Health challenge, and we need to connect those dots as well.
You're absolutely right. And there are certainly ways that we can focus that research in locations and with kinds of animals that we know are high risk for being infected by coronaviruses, for example, and other viruses with a history of emergence into the human population, especially some of these wild animal farms in Asia, where we know hosts for coronaviruses with very close relatives of SARS-CoV-2 have been found in recent years. We really need to do a much better job with surveillance in those kind of locations. And we can do it both ways. We can look for viruses in animals, but we can also monitor the people handling these kind of animals to see what's capable of infecting the people and how often that happens, and whether there's a risk of human-to-human transmission when that does occur. And those are all things that we're very capable of doing if we just have the resources and the dedication to continuing this kind of work.
Great. And I should add for the audience, there is a Q&A button for those of you who would like to ask questions, and it will hopefully funnel through to me to ask our panelists. Let's go to a different way of asking some of the questions that you brought forward in statements. This webinar is part of the Jerusalem Ethics Forum. So let's ask the question bluntly: how do ethics and equity interact with economics? We had a prior panel that a researcher talked about the calculation that for $28 billion or so, that number may or may not be the correct number, you could save trillions of dollars of global impact, which I think evidence will prove out. Whatever the exact numbers are, that was clear that the loss of global economic activity dramatically trumped the cost of providing vaccines if you could get them distributed around the world. So what's your perspective on that? Have the thought processes of the question of how we're all connected and how nobody's really safe till everybody's safe, that statement we've heard so often, how has that changed from your perspectives as we've progressed through this pandemic?
Well, I mean, I think that we had a warning shot in 2009 when we saw what happened with vaccine access. It was a relatively mild pandemic, and so the consequences weren't very visible. but I mean, it was very small volumes of vaccine that were available to developing countries in 2009. And so I think the community rightly worked to put a mechanism, COVAX, in place to get ahead of this problem. But at the end of the day, we fell far short of the goal of having timely, equitable allocation of vaccine despite those efforts. Now, the reality is that most of the power in this equation resides with governments, government leaders. I mean, they have the financial resources. Every vaccine company is housed inside a sovereign nation that has authorities. There are supply chains that are controlled by governmental authorities. And so the reality is that if there isn't political leadership around this issue of equitable access, then it's unlikely to happen. And yet political leaders are often constrained by the will of and expectations of their people. I mean, political leaders are put into office in order to protect their populations against national security, economic, and health threats, amongst others. And so it takes a very courageous and special kind of leader to counterbalance that with a commitment to global equitable access. And so I think the world needs to reflect on that reality and think about how can we put things in place, mechanisms in place to ensure greater, more equitable access the next time this happens. I don't want to suggest that companies don't have a role. Companies do have a role here, for sure, and that comes down to decisions that companies make around how to try to shape availability of countermeasures. But I do think the governments play the key role, in my view. I do think that there are some very promising signs here. If you look at what Merck has, the commitment that Merck has made around molnupiravir, Julie could talk about this, but I think that they've really set a standard for how companies can operate, at least in the small molecule space. And we have another second antiviral that's coming forward from Pfizer and with great promise, and hopefully we'll see something similar there. But it is possible to address this issue of access if we focus on it. So I'm hopeful these lessons will really be embraced and that we'll do something about it before the next one.
I think we scientists have a unique opportunity right now to educate both our political leaders and the general public about what we do between outbreaks that seems very obscure and sometimes as someone who studied the evolution of viruses, irrelevant to the disease process and developing countermeasures. But I think we have a unique opportunity now. The public's very interested because of COVID to explain why it's critical to study the evolution of viruses, to study viruses in wildlife in West Africa and Southeast Asia, to study what is infecting people in these parts of the world and to diagnose them properly, why that can help make their life better sometime in the future. And we scientists are usually not very good at communicating with the public. We talk over people's heads. I think we also need to educate physicians, other healthcare providers, and especially scientists how to communicate better with the public. And this is the best possible time to do that because the public is more interested than ever in what we do.
Well, let's go on, Julie.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with this communication issue. We have teachable moments here, but it's daunting. And I love that Scott said the scientists have a role because I think there still is enough trust in science and enough recognition now of how critical science has been in helping us cope with this pandemic that we really do have the opportunity to kind of push the reset button and hopefully get further ahead than we were when we started this one.
Beyond the three of you, are there any future leaders or enterprises that you think in particular have taken an important role or leading role that you'd like to mention?
I think the Africa CDC and the African Union have really have done a lot. I think, and I'll call out John Nkengasong and his leadership at the Africa CDC as being a key individual in this equation. But there are many others. I mean, I do want to make a comment about COVAX, which is a partnership between Gavi, CEPI, and the WHO. And COVAX is being criticized in some circles because of the point that I made earlier around inequitable access to vaccines. But I think we need to understand that these institutions that are established or enterprises, have limitations. If they're not resourced adequately and in a timely fashion, if they don't have, they don't have authority. I mean, just like the WHO doesn't have authority beyond what the member states granted, COVAX doesn't have authority per se. So I think we have to be realistic about what can be done, and it has to, an entity like COVAX alone can't fix or can't address a problem like this. Having said that, I think there are some really important learnings from COVAX that will hopefully inform a subsequent iteration as we prepare for the next pandemic that makes it better and even more likely to be successful. But that doesn't take away from the good work and the absolute right intention of those who who created it to try to get ahead of this equity challenge that we're facing.
And I just, it is important to remember that there are global inequities, but there are also important equities internal to each country, including the United States. It's no surprise that almost every parameter for measuring the impact of the pandemic is stratified on the basis of socioeconomic condition or class. Part of that has to do with the underlying social determinants of health and health outcomes, of course, but some of that also has to do with the willingness to participate and availability and access to countermeasure delivery. So have to really examine the issue of inequity through the ethical lens as well as the economic lens. I think both are really important dimensions of analysis. And right now the picture is not pretty, but you asked who else we should acknowledge and recognize as contributing to the global mechanisms, certainly the African mechanisms that Rajeev has outlined. But I do think the civil society, and in particular, some of the more prominent global foundations and philanthropists have been very important in this. We can certainly speak of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also the Wellcome Trust has done an amazing amount. Jeremy has been, the CEO has been really standing strong on what needs to be done to contain the pandemic, but also really behind the scenes and overtly working to make clear why we need to have a better allocation scheme for getting these countermeasures available to people. It also kind of loops back, as you mentioned, that manufacturers have a role in this. It is true that even in the US, where some of our supply chain and procurement opportunities have been affected by the Defense Production Act, which means we don't have the same availability of certain supplies that we would under normal conditions because they've been prioritized for use in vaccine production, et cetera. But what we do have the ability as manufacturers is to plan our own resilience plans. We can negotiate contracts that allow for a more global and equitable distribution. And especially those of us who are multinational, we have people we serve all over the world, including in poorly resourced countries, and we have employees in those environments. So I think our moral standard of what we need to accomplish on a global basis is present. I feel very fortunate to work for a company where our CEO at the time the pandemic began, Ken Frazier, and our current CEO also are people of principle who understand the importance that shared values bring to a business. And so that shared value in terms of our ethics and our integrity really set the groundwork for the decision-making that we've tried to undertake. Of course, we're disappointed that we didn't have one of the vaccines that was the most useful early on, but We certainly have worked hard to collaborate with J&J in the production of their vaccine. And as Rajeev said, we're working to make our antiviral available to the generics manufacturers, both through several licensing agreements in India, but now through the medicines patent pool, so that this small molecule, which is relatively easy to make, can get to people who need it faster. But we had planned for that long before we could execute those steps. And I think knowing that the foundation for an ethical allocation is part of the consciousness of a company like Merck and many others really helps to assure that the private sector can do its part as well.
Do you think that the distribution and last mile issue or question has been resolved enough to be able to get a vaccine or a small molecule to the populations that are of the, I guess, most complex need? I think that's one of the questions we've been asking a lot during this pandemic. And what have you collectively seen has been the progress in addressing that problem?
Oh, I'm glad you used the word progress, Ken, because there is progress, but no, the last mile is incomplete everywhere, in every country, including the United States. So the distribution challenges are magnified in parts of the world that lacked ordinary measures for reaching people for adult immunizations, for example, or diagnostics that Scott's been really emphasizing in this conversation. So there's a great amplification of that challenge in resource poor countries, but nevertheless, the last mile challenge is there. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the most tragic aspect of that is that lack of trust that even if you have product and it is available and is distributed so that it could be administered that last mile or that last inch, if people aren't willing to take advantage of it, that's a humanitarian tragedy, and that's exactly where we are. We have worked hard to try to build and sustain trust. Again, as Scott earlier mentioned, the importance of trustworthy communication. I think that's been very problematic almost everywhere in the world during this pandemic. And when you hold out some of the exemplars that are the exceptions to that rule, like the president of New Zealand, for example, and really study what it was that helped her be so effective in galvanizing her population and helping her country make the best possible stance against the pandemic. They're just the simple old-fashioned rules of risk communication, but somehow those rules really get distorted because of the intensity of the political process, the polarization, the populism, and the fear, the underlying fear and fatigue in a sense now that we're experiencing. So we are really a long way from covering that last inch when it comes to vaccination.
So we're coming up. Thank you, Julie. Really important words. We're on the last few minutes of this. We've touched briefly, if you will, on surveillance and diagnostics, on research investment, on clinical testing, on regulatory approval, on cost of medicines, and distribution in the last mile, kind of the continuum from seeing it to dealing with it directly. Any final comments from the three of you, or they'd say differently, I'd love final comments from the three of you as we end this really insightful and extraordinary discussion.
I just wanted to mention one other factor related to education that I think has been very positive about COVID, and that is the reporting of the news media on COVID, in my opinion, has been really extraordinary. A lot of science reporters, I think, have gone the extra mile to understand much better what's going on with this pandemic, with product development, the challenges of global distribution, the challenges of educating the public about the safety and efficacy of products. And I hope that that's at least partly because the scientific community has interacted very well with the news media. And I hope that's something that will continue even after hopefully COVID is behind us in the not too distant future, that we engage scientific reporters and help them to do the best that they can explaining the science to the public. I think we've made good progress in that area.
Julie, some final comments?
First of all, thank you for having this conversation. It has been far-ranging, but at the same time, it just all comes back to the simple reality that we are going to face these challenges going forward. And we have learned a tremendous amount in the course of the last 20 months or so. But it really is up to us as leaders in our various fields and as people who have the opportunity and the privilege of speaking on behalf of what we've learned, to really not throw our own towel in too quickly, but to maintain our conversation and maintain our commitment to really helping everyone learn the lessons of this pandemic and walk through that portal very differently than we entered it.
Great. And Rajeev, final word?
Well, I think that we have I'll look at it from a positive standpoint. We have the benefit of having seen the many gaps that exist in our current systems, but also the opportunities to do better. And on the most positive side, I think we have a technological way forward to as we said, take pandemic threats off the table, potentially. A lot needs to be done to get to that point, but it is within reach, I believe. There are other areas where the path forward is less clear. On the equity side, we have some interesting concepts, but whether there will be the political will and fortitude to do what's necessary to ensure equity is an open question. And then a topic that we've touched on, which is misinformation and its proliferation and the loss of trust in institutions and authorities. That's a really hard one. And I don't know I don't think any of us have the answer to how to fix that, but it's certainly something that is going to outlast this pandemic. Potentially, that may be the longest tail coming out of this pandemic, is the loss of trust in institutions and in authorities amongst some communities. And we really have to think hard about how we can address the structural issues, the information access issues, and others to have that not be the impediment that it proved to be in this pandemic. But I think we probably all leave with or look at the current moment as one hopefully filled with hope that these are, at least we know what the problems are. And in the event that we face, or when we face the next pandemic, which by the way could be worse than this pandemic, there's plenty of room to have a tougher pathogen to fight, that we'll be much better prepared than we were today.
Well, thanks. And I hope we've tried to focus on the half full glasses with the concept of filling them further in the years and decades to come from these learning experiences. So I thank the three of you, our stellar panelists. I thank you, audience, for joining us today and for taking the time from your schedules to listen in as these really wonderful, experienced people share their insights. As a note, these webinars are recorded and viewable on the Galien Foundation website. There obviously will be future Galien and Global Virus Network webinars, and we hope you'll join us. And I thank you all again, Scott, Rajeev, Julie, for your comments and thoughts today, and wish everybody well. Thanks a lot for joining.